Hello, I'm David Beeson, and it's time for Chapter 5 of A History of Spain, which is going to focus on a blaze of glory, followed by a decline in flames. That's the flames of cremation, which then led to burial, as usual. But we're not talking about people, we're talking about buildings, which I think you'll admit is fairly unusual. This is going to be the episode where we focus on the meteoric rise and then the fading and decline of the great culture of Tartessos in southern Iberia. Now, we saw last week how Iberian society had continued more or less unperturbed following the collapse of Argaric culture. People kept growing food. So we saw a community like La Yoma de Bechi with its fine farmstead, well built, continuing to carry out intensive agriculture at a quite sophisticated level. Similarly, in Peñalosa, we saw a village built on the side of a hill with terraced housing and workshops, continuing to do some fairly remarkable metalwork. Archaeologists have also found traces of early moves towards serious building. The traces aren't terribly visible anymore because the successors of the early builders built their own buildings on top of the old ones. But there are more than hints that people were beginning to learn to build pretty impressively. And we'll soon see that in the High Tartessos period, buildings were both sophisticated and very impressive indeed. Now, that's not building of cities. It's true that Argaric society had densely inhabited urban centres. That seems not to have been the case in Tartessos. We're not talking about Greece with its Athens and its Corinth, or Egypt with its Thebes or its Memphis, or even the people we met last week, the Phoenicians with their Byblos and Sidon and Tyre. It seems likely that the Tartessian people lived in relatively loose, open villages or towns. What they set up was monumental buildings for ritual purposes, no doubt, perhaps also for administration, serving whole communities. Two of the most striking have now been sufficiently excavated by archaeologists for us to be able to reconstitute what they originally looked like. They're in the province of Badajoz in Extremadura, near the Portuguese border. One of these, the Casas del Turuñuelo, is a two-level site of relatively low buildings with a large patio tiled in irregularly cut slate. A remarkable wide staircase leads down to the patio. The other outstanding site is Cancho Roano. It was much larger and it was set on a sort of artificial island formed by putting a moat around it and filling it with water. What we're going to be looking at in this episode is how it was contact between the already sophisticated societies in Iberia and the even more complex culture from Phoenicia that inspired the creation of such outstanding monumental buildings. And then we're going to see what happened to them in the end. Now, what led to the increasing contact between Iberians and Phoenicians in the first place? Well, since metalwork was continuing much as it had before, all along the Mediterranean seaboard in the east of Iberia, and then around to the Atlantic seaboard in the south, people had maintained, I'm sure, some of the contacts with the kind of networks for importing metals, like tin, vital for the bronze of the Bronze Age, well after the collapse of El Argar. Now, those networks would have brought them into contact with lots of other people, and in particular with the Phoenicians. And they, as we discovered last week, were seafaring people, keen on commerce, and no doubt always open to finding the main chance and following it up. That brought them eventually, as they spread across the Mediterranean, to Iberia. That happened at around the 9th century BCE, and they found it a gold mine, literally, though it was rather more of a silver mine and even more of a copper mine. Phoenician society was highly sophisticated with its brilliant new alphabetic system of writing and its highly developed craftsmanship in fabrics, in wood, and above all in metalwork and jewellery. Now they were coming into contact with people who'd maintained their own skills and developed them, in particular in metalwork. They could hardly have been readier to absorb and take advantage of the kind of influence and knowledge that the Phoenicians could transfer to them. Nowhere was that truer than in Tartessos, down in the south of Iberia. Its heartland was along the river valley of what we now call the Guadalquivir, which flows into the Atlantic some 80 or 90 kilometres south of Seville. The area of the estuary is prone to silting and shifting marshland, and the river once flowed into a large bay which is no longer there. The river was navigable a long way inland, so even places close to modern-day Seville would have felt linked to the Mediterranean and Atlantic trade. The Guadalquivir connected rich, fertile agricultural areas with the sea. This was a time which would last right up to very close to our own days, certainly up to the 18th century before the Industrial Revolution, when ultimately all wealth traced back to land. Controlling the land meant controlling food production, and in particular the production of any surplus food that there might be. Now we're talking about a time when, as we've already seen, a lot of effort was going into things like producing high-quality metalwork. There's no doubt at all that wealth would have been displayed in jewellery and in metalwork of high standard. But the real basis of wealth remained the land and control of the food produced from it. That kind of control particularly gave the groups who held it the ability to direct manpower into projects that they valued. It seems highly likely that just before the glory days of Tartessos, groups led by aristocratic elites of this kind were beginning to emerge in the Guadalquivir Valley in the area that would eventually become Tartessos. The name Tartessos was actually first used by the Greek historian Herodotus, but he was writing at a time when Tartessos was already well into its decline and beginning to turn into the subject matter of legend. It's not clear whether he thought of Tartessos as the name of a river, in which case we would probably identify it with the Guadalquivir, or of a city at the mouth of the river. Now it seems highly unlikely that there would have been a great city there like Athens or Tyre or Carthage, but it's possible that there was a settlement there. It's not hard to imagine that seafarers arriving there and finding that it was wealthy and a good centre for trade might begin to think of it as a city, and reporting back home, the image that they would have created might have been something like the great cities of Phoenicia or of Greece. If there ever was a settlement there, it would have been much smaller than any of those great cities, and it's disappeared since, probably buried by the constant silting and shifting marshlands of the Guadalquivir estuary. Herodotus even identified a king of Tartessos called Argar, who ruled for 80 years. All that sounds extremely unlikely. Just as I'm very sceptical about the existence of a major city at the mouth of the Guadalquivir, I'm sceptical that there was ever anything that could have been a capital of Tartessos, or any single individual who was its king. What seems far more likely, and I'm going to go on believing until such a time as further evidence comes to prove the contrary, is that Tartessos was more of a culture of a bunch of highly autonomous, decentralized communities, led in each case by an aristocratic elite, with which the Phoenicians and later the Greeks could do business, but without any capital or any individual leader who one could regard as a king. As for the word Tartessos, well, we don't have another one, so I'm going to go on using it for that culture. The Phoenicians were so enthusiastic about their contacts with these people that they founded another colony, not quite as grand as Carthage, but a major centre nonetheless, in their region, down on the Atlantic coast of Iberia. They called it Gadir. The Spanish today call it Cádiz, and English speakers often refer to it as Cadiz. There they built their warehouses to store goods for onward sale in Iberia or for export back eastward in the Mediterranean. It was a wonderful spot to build such a colony. It's out on a peninsula, which makes it highly defensible, and it has a lovely bay to act as a harbour. You can still visit some of the storage areas where the Phoenicians kept the goods that they traded. Indeed, one of them is known as the Cave of the Blue Bird, and according to its publicity, that's now the oldest flamenco concert hall in the world. From Gadir, Phoenician merchants would fan out throughout Iberia and above all into Tartessos, trading goods from other parts of the Mediterranean, whether it's olive oil or wine or high-quality ceramics or glassware or jewellery, and in return receiving mostly raw materials, metals above all, but also a much sought-after fish sauce and indeed fish itself to export back eastward. This resembles a pattern that later colonial systems have ended up making familiar to us. The colonizing power brings in finished goods and takes out raw materials, keeping the real value-added step, the conversion of raw materials into finished goods, firmly under its own control. In any case, the connection to the Mediterranean trade provided by the Phoenicians gave the Tartessians a colossal boost and led to the emergence of an extremely wealthy aristocratic elite. That was very much like what happened in El Argar. The Tartessians were almost certainly a great deal wealthier, however, though in a society where it seems likely there was far less centralized control, they might not have been quite as powerful. You might think that a lot of this trade would have been simply barter, where you would exchange so much glassware and jewellery for so much copper and silver. But in fact, what was beginning to emerge was something like a currency system, where weight of silver became the common denominator, the unit by which price was established. So it was so much weight of silver for so much glassware or for so much raw material. One of the things that the Phoenicians did, much to the admiration of the Iberians, was keep accounts, keep records of what they were doing. So the Tartessians, along with their Iberian cousins in the south and the others up the eastern seaboard, would join the list of people adopting the brilliant Phoenician idea of alphabetic writing. For the first time, Iberia was seeing the emergence of cultures with writing systems capable of telling their own story. We know what the Tartessian characters looked like. We can even identify the sounds they corresponded to. Sadly, what we don't know is the language they were written in, so we can decipher some inscriptions, but we don't necessarily know what they mean. It was possibly a pre-Indo-European language, and certainly one that we don't at this stage know anything like enough about. Writing was obviously the most important influence that the Phoenicians exerted on the Tartessians, but it was by no means the only one. I pointed out before that colonizing powers like to maintain the value-added step of actually turning raw materials into finished products in their own hands. But in time, Tartessians who had started off by buying goods from the Phoenicians eventually started to make their own with some spectacular results. They produced some fine ceramics, certainly the equal of anything that they were importing. They did some fine sculpture. There's an outstanding Tartessian winged feline statue in the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. And they produced some outstanding jewellery, perhaps nowhere more strikingly than in the treasure of the Carambolo, though, to be honest, I have to admit that some archaeologists believe that that was Phoenician work. Through their connections with Mediterranean networks, essentially the Phoenicians, but later on the Greeks too, Tartessos flourished. It grew, it prospered, it became powerful. It even grew in extent, with Tartessian settlements springing up along another river valley, that of the Guadiana, to the west of the Guadalquivir, leading eventually to a regional Tartessian culture that extended from the Mediterranean coast of what is now Andalusia right through to the Portuguese coast on the Atlantic. With all that power and all that wealth, and with manpower they could direct to their favourite projects, the leaders of Tartessian communities could start to put up those spectacular and monumental buildings like Cancho Roano that would become the hallmark of their culture. But like so many instances of nations or cultures that grow to great strength and power, the glory of Tartessos didn't last. Tartessos began to decline in the late 6th century BCE, starting in the Guadiana Valley. We don't know exactly why. It's true that these are areas subject to flooding, and it's possible that the water levels rose and it became unviable to maintain some of the settlements there, but there may have been other reasons. Some archaeologists have even suggested that it might have been pressure from the north, where the Indo-European societies were beginning to spread outwards, but there's little evidence of any kind of conflict or invasion or any kind of fighting. Whatever the reason, it's true that those settlements began to close down. People abandoned them. And that's when we start to get that curious phenomenon that I mentioned at the start of this episode of people burning and then burying their most important buildings. One of the places where this happened was the Casas del Turuñuelo, which I mentioned before. I spoke about its slate-tiled patio, and though we don't know exactly what that was used for in general, we do know that just before the place was abandoned, major animal sacrifices took place there. 42 horses, 9 cows, 4 deer, and even 1 dog. Interestingly, when the cows were sacrificed, there are clear signs that the meat was used for a massive banquet. That sounds rather like a funeral dinner, as though people were preparing the process of saying goodbye to their building before consigning it to the grave. After the banquet, the building was burnt, and then a mound of earth was piled up on top of it. Now, doesn't that sound like cremation followed by burial? Esther Rodriguez Gonzalez, co-director of excavations at the Turuñuelo site, rather ruthfully points out that building that mound was no easy task. A lot of effort went into it. She knows that because of the effort it took to dig it out again. A lot was destroyed in the site before it was buried. Among the more significant findings of the archaeologists there were some fragments of naturalistic sculptures of human faces, something unusual in Iberia up to that time, since depictions of humans had generally been highly stylized. There were even the rather finely sculpted feet of a statue. Now, they may be able to reassemble the statue at some stage, because obviously the other fragments are still lying around somewhere. But Esther Rodriguez, in any case, believes that the style with which the feet have been formed is reminiscent of an Etruscan statue of around the same period, the Venere di Canicella, the Venus of Canicella. And she imagines that if we were ever able to reconstitute the whole of the statue, it might very well look like her. Clearly, the statue does not depict Venus, who was a Roman goddess. It was more likely to be someone like Astarte, a Phoenician goddess whose worship was adopted quite widely in the Iberian Peninsula. At any rate, the Turunuelo houses are a remarkable testament to a flourishing, powerful, prosperous culture. Its destruction in this ritualistic way feels very like an act of mourning by people bereaved by the loss of a much-loved and much-missed member of the very community that they're about to leave. This isn't simply decline, it feels a lot like tragedy. Nor was the Casas de Turunuelo alone in facing this fate. A number of Tartessian sites were burnt and buried in the same way. Among them, perhaps the most notable of all, was the other site I mentioned earlier, Canchoruano. It too ended up ceremonially burnt and buried under a mound. So on the face of it, it looks as though Tartessos went the same way as the cultures we'd be considering before, Los Millares and El Argar. It blazed to glory and then it faded away and vanished. That may not have been the case, though. There are many archaeologists who now believe that what happened in Tartessos is that it shrank back to its old heartland around the Guadalquivir. There it morphed and its people got a new name, the Turdetani. That's what they were called when they came into contact with the Romans a couple of centuries later. And it's perhaps not surprising, given the history of Tartessos, that the Romans found that with their fine art, their writing, and their sophisticated financial arrangements, they even had coinage, the Turdetani were the most sophisticated and civilized peoples of Iberia. That would mean that Tartessos didn't die. It shrank, certainly, but survived in reduced form until it was absorbed by Rome. That's something we're going to come back to. Next week, however, what we're going to look at is what happened to the rest of Iberia while all these exciting things were going on. Until then, have a great week and many thanks for listening.